At 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could throw at me. I'd buried my husband of 45 years, raised 3 children mostly on my own, and weathered more storms than I care to count. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the Christmas dinner that would change everything between my family and me forever. What started as my annual tradition of hosting the family holiday gathering turned into the most humiliating night of my life when my own daughter decided I wasn't good enough to sit at my own dining room table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Mara Henderson, and I've spent the last 6 decades being the glue that held our family together, the one everyone turned to when they needed help, advice, or just someone to listen. Little did they know that their cruelty on Christmas Eve would come back to haunt them in ways they never imagined, because sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who holds all the cards. I've lived in the same modest 2-bedroom house in Riverside, Oregon for over 30 years. It's nothing fancy, just a simple craftsman-style home with a wraparound porch and a garden that's been my pride and joy since Robert passed away 5 years ago. The house sits on Maple Street, where the neighbors still wave to each other, and children ride their bikes on the sidewalks without fear. It's the kind of neighborhood where everybody knows everybody, and I've been the unofficial grandmother to half the kids on the block over the years. My daughter Jessica lives about 20 minutes away in what she calls the better part of town, though I've never understood why newer and bigger automatically means better. She married Kevin Walsh 15 years ago, and they have 2 children together, Tyler, who's 17 now, and Emma, who just turned 14. Jessica has always been ambitious, maybe too ambitious, for her own good. She works as a real estate agent for one of those high-end firms that cater to wealthy clients, and Kevin manages a car dealership that sells luxury vehicles. They live in a sprawling suburban home with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool, the kind of place that screams success to anyone driving by. For the past 23 years, ever since Jessica got married, I've hosted Christmas dinner at my little house. It became our family tradition, something I looked forward to all year long. I'd start planning the menu in November, carefully selecting each dish to make sure everyone's favorites were included. Tyler loved my homemade rolls with honey butter, Emma always asked for my special green bean casserole, and Kevin never missed an opportunity to praise my roasted turkey with sage stuffing. Jessica usually helped with the preparations, though in recent years, she'd become more focused on taking photos for her social media accounts than actually participating in the cooking. This past Christmas season started like any other. I spent weeks preparing, cleaning my house from top to bottom, polishing the good china that had belonged to my mother, and making sure every detail was perfect. I'd invited them for Christmas Eve dinner, as had become our custom, planning to serve at 6 o'clock sharp. I'd spent 2 days preparing the meal, getting up early to start the turkey, making homemade cranberry sauce, and preparing my famous pumpkin pie from scratch. The dining room table was set with my best linens, the ones I'd embroidered myself during the long evenings after Robert died. Candles flickered on the mantelpiece, and I'd even put up a small Christmas tree in the corner, decorated with ornaments the grandchildren had made over the years. Jessica, Kevin, and the kids arrived at 5:30, and I immediately noticed something was different. Jessica seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone, while Kevin appeared uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Tyler barely looked up from his own phone, and Emma seemed unusually quiet. I brushed off my concerns, telling myself that everyone was just tired from the holiday rush. The first sign of trouble came when Jessica pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was putting the finishing touches on the gravy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She had that look on her face, the one she'd worn as a teenager when she was about to ask for something she knew I wouldn't want to give her. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying that artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted something, "I need to talk to you about dinner tonight." I set down my whisk and turned to face her, already sensing that whatever she was about to say would ruin the evening I'd spent weeks planning. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "Well, the thing is, Kevin's boss is in town for the holidays, and he's been trying to get a promotion for months now. This is really important for his career, you understand?" She paused. as if waiting for me to fill in the blanks. But I remained silent, letting her continue. Mr. Davidson called this afternoon and said he'd love to join us for Christmas dinner. He's staying at the Riverside Inn and he doesn't have anywhere else to go. I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to remain positive. That's wonderful, dear. I always make more than enough food. I can easily set another place at the table. Jessica's expression became strained, and she looked toward the dining room where I'd spent hours arranging everything perfectly. That's just it, Mom. The thing is, your dining room table only seats 6 people comfortably, and with Mr. Davidson joining us, we'll be 7. Kevin and I were thinking that maybe it would be better if you ate in the kitchen tonight. So the adults can have proper conversation about business and things. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there in my own kitchen, wearing the apron I'd sewn myself, surrounded by the dinner I'd spent 2 days preparing, and my own daughter was asking me to eat alone in the kitchen like hired help. For a moment I couldn't even speak. The silence stretched between us as I processed what she'd just said. "You want me to eat in the kitchen?" I said slowly, making sure I'd heard her correctly. "In my own house. On Christmas Eve." Jessica's face flushed slightly, but she pressed on. "It's not personal, Mom. It's just that this dinner is really important for Kevin's career. Mr. Davidson is used to a certain level of sophistication. You understand, don't you?" I understood perfectly. I understood that my daughter was ashamed of me, ashamed of my simple house, my hand-me-down furniture, my lack of what she considered sophistication. I understood that after raising her, supporting her through college, babysitting her children countless times, and always being there whenever she needed me, I was now considered an embarrassment to be hidden away. "I see," I said quietly. "And what about Tyler and Emma? Are they too unsophisticated for this important dinner as well?" "The kids will sit at the table, of course. They're part of the family that Mr. Davidson wants to meet. It's just—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have made her cruelty even more explicit. I turned back to the stove, stirring the gravy with mechanical precision while my mind raced. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Whatever you think is best." The relief on Jessica's face was immediate and telling. She'd expected me to argue, to fight for my place at my own table. But I'd given in without a struggle. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 73 years learning when to pick my battles, and this wasn't the time for mine. 20 minutes later, Kevin's boss arrived, and the introductions were made in my living room. Mr. Davidson was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, expensively dressed and clearly accustomed to being the center of attention. He complimented my home's quaint charm in a way that made it clear he considered it far beneath his usual standards, and I watched Jessica's face flush with embarrassment at his barely concealed condescension. As they moved to the dining room, I retreated to the kitchen with a plate of food that I'd prepared for myself. Through the doorway, I could hear the conversation flowing around my absence, Kevin regaling his boss with stories about successful car sales, and Jessica discussing her latest real estate deals. Neither of them mentioned me, as if I'd simply vanished from existence the moment I'd been banished from their important dinner. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, the one where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 30 years, listening to the sounds of my family, enjoying the meal I'd spent days preparing. The irony wasn't lost on me that Tyler and Emma, the grandchildren I'd helped raise, were sitting at my dining room table while I, the person who'd made the entire evening possible, was relegated to the kitchen like a servant. But as I sat there, picking at my food and listening to their conversation, I began to notice things. Kevin's voice carried a nervous edge whenever he talked about work, and I caught fragments of conversation that suggested his job wasn't as secure as he'd been pretending. Jessica mentioned several real estate deals that had fallen through, and her laughter seemed forced whenever Mr. Davidson made jokes about the struggling market. The evening dragged on interminably. I could hear them in the next room, their voices growing louder as they consumed the wine I'd bought specifically for Christmas dinner. Nobody came to check on me, nobody offered to help with the dishes, and nobody seemed to notice or care that I was spending Christmas Eve alone in my own kitchen. Around 9 o'clock, I heard chairs scraping as dinner finally concluded. I quickly busied myself with cleaning up, not wanting to appear to be eavesdropping when they returned to the kitchen. Jessica appeared first, Her face flushed from wine, and what she clearly considered a successful evening. "Mom, dinner was absolutely wonderful," she said, her voice carrying that artificial enthusiasm that meant she was trying to make amends without actually acknowledging what she'd done. Mr. Davidson was so impressed with everything. He said the turkey was the best he'd ever tasted. I continued washing dishes, my back turned to her. "I'm glad he enjoyed it," I said simply. "And the table looked beautiful. Really elegant. I think the smaller group made for much better conversation, don't you think?" I set down the plate I'd been washing and turned to face her. For a moment, I considered telling her exactly what I thought about her behavior, about how she'd treated me in my own home, about the years of sacrifices I'd made for her family. But instead, I simply nodded and said, "I'm sure it did." The rest of the family filtered into the kitchen to say their goodbyes. Kevin shook my hand and thanked me for the meal, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Tyler mumbled something about the food being good, still focused on his phone. Emma, my sweet granddaughter, was the only one who seemed to sense that something was wrong. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "I missed you at dinner, Grandma." Her words nearly broke my composure, but I managed to hold myself together until after they'd all left. Only then, alone in my kitchen with the dishes done and the dining room table cleared, did I allow myself to fully process what had happened. I walked through my house, looking at the Christmas decorations I'd put up with such joy just weeks before. The tree in the corner suddenly seemed pathetic rather than festive, its handmade ornaments looking shabby instead of sentimental. The family photos on the mantelpiece felt like monuments to my own foolishness, evidence of years spent prioritizing people who clearly didn't value me in return. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep, replaying the evening's events and trying to understand how I'd raised a daughter who could treat me with such casual cruelty. I thought about all the times I'd babysat Tyler and Emma when Jessica and Kevin needed a night out, all the times I'd helped with school projects and soccer practices, all the birthday parties and family gatherings I'd hosted over the years. I thought about the financial help I'd given them when they'd needed a down payment for their house, the countless meals I'd prepared, the endless hours of free childcare I'd provided. But most of all, I thought about the look on Jessica's face when she'd asked me to eat in the kitchen. There hadn't been any real regret there, just inconvenience at having to ask. She'd been embarrassed by me, by my simple house and my lack of sophistication, and she'd been willing to humiliate me in my own home rather than risk her husband's career advancement. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on my front porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The neighborhood was quiet, with most families still asleep, probably recovering from their own Christmas celebrations. I thought about previous Christmas mornings when Tyler and Emma were younger, how they'd come running to my house to show me their presents, how we'd spend the morning baking cookies and playing games. This Christmas morning, my phone remained silent. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement that I even existed. It was as if Christmas Eve had never happened, as if I'd imagined the entire humiliating experience. But I hadn't imagined it, and I wasn't going to pretend that I had. Sitting there on my porch, watching the world wake up around me, I began to think about what I actually knew about my daughter's life, about the conversations I'd overheard, about the small inconsistencies in their stories that I'd always chosen to ignore out of love and respect for their privacy. You see, when you've lived as long as I have, you develop a certain skill for reading people and situations. You learn to pick up on the things that aren't said, the tensions that simmer beneath polite conversation, the small signs that suggest all is not as it appears. And over the years, I'd noticed quite a few things about Jessica and Kevin's supposedly successful life that hadn't quite added up. There were the hushed phone conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room, the way Kevin's jaw tightened whenever anyone mentioned money, the increasing frequency of Jessica's complaints about difficult clients and deals that fell through at the last minute. I'd seen the stress lines around her eyes, the way she'd started drinking more wine at family gatherings, the expensive purchases followed by periods of obvious belt-tightening. But I'd always kept my observations to myself, following the unwritten rule that parents shouldn't pry into their adult children's business unless specifically asked. I'd offered help when they'd asked for it, provided babysitting when they'd needed it, and kept my mouth shut about the things that concerned me. Now, sitting on my porch on Christmas morning, I began to wonder if my silence had been a mistake. Maybe if I'd paid closer attention, if I'd asked more questions, if I'd been less willing to accept their explanations at face value, I might have seen what was coming. Because something was definitely coming. I could feel it in the way a person feels an approaching storm. That subtle change in atmospheric pressure that makes animals restless and old injuries ache. The pieces were all there, scattered across years of conversations and observations, waiting for someone to put them together into a coherent picture. And I was someone who'd had plenty of practice putting puzzles together. After all, I'd spent 4 decades managing household budgets, raising children, and navigating the complex social dynamics of small-town life. I'd learned to read between the lines, to notice the things that others missed, to understand the difference between what people said and what they actually meant. As the sun climbed higher and the morning grew warmer, I made myself a second cup of coffee and began to seriously consider what I actually knew about my daughter's life. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty, but it was becoming clearer by the minute. Jessica's real estate career had been struggling for over a year, though she'd been careful to hide the extent of her problems from the family. I'd overheard enough phone conversations to know that several major deals had fallen through, and her commission income had dropped significantly. Kevin's situation at the dealership was even more precarious, despite his confident talk about promotions and success. But it wasn't just their professional struggles that concerned me. There were other things, darker things, that I'd noticed but never fully acknowledged. The way they'd suddenly started socializing with a different crowd. People who seemed to have money but whose sources of income were never quite clear. The expensive vacations that didn't match their supposed financial situation. The designer clothes and luxury items that appeared despite their claims of budgetary constraints. I'd always assumed that they were simply better at managing money than I'd given them credit for, or that Kevin's job was more lucrative than I'd understood. But now, sitting alone on Christmas morning after being humiliated in my own home, I began to consider other possibilities. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together into a picture that made my stomach turn. The late-night phone calls, the whispered conversations, the obvious stress that neither of them would explain, the way they'd started asking me increasingly specific questions about my own finances and assets. I realized that I'd been willfully blind to signs that should have been obvious to someone with my experience and intuition. I'd wanted to believe that my daughter was successful and happy, so I'd ignored the evidence that suggested otherwise. I'd trusted her explanations because I loved her, not because they actually made sense. But trust, I was learning, was a luxury I could no longer afford. Not after the way they'd treated me on Christmas Eve. Not after being relegated to the kitchen in my own home while they entertained someone they considered more important than the woman who'd raised them. As I sat there on my porch, watching the neighborhood come to life around me, I began to understand that Christmas Eve had been more than just a moment of cruelty. It had been a revelation, a glimpse into how my daughter really saw me, and what she was willing to do to advance her own interests. The question now was what I was going to do with that knowledge. For 73 years, I'd been the kind of person who kept her mouth shut and her opinions to herself, who prioritized family harmony over personal satisfaction. But Christmas Eve had changed something fundamental in me, had awakened a part of my personality that I'd kept carefully suppressed for decades. I was still sitting on my porch, lost in thought, when Linda Morrison appeared at my front gate. Linda lived 2 houses down and had been my closest friend since she'd moved to the neighborhood 8 years ago. She was a widow like me, though she'd lost her husband to cancer rather than a heart attack, and we'd bonded over our shared experiences of navigating life alone after decades of marriage. "Mara, honey," she called out, her voice carrying the concern that had made her such a good friend over the years. "Are you all right? I saw your family leave last night, but I haven't seen you outside all morning." I waved her up to the porch, grateful for the company and the distraction from my increasingly dark thoughts. Linda climbed the steps with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to trust her 70-year-old knees, settling into the rocking chair beside mine with a small sigh of relief. "How was your Christmas Eve?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be entirely positive. I found myself telling her the entire story, starting with Jessica's request that I eat in the kitchen and ending with my solitary Christmas morning. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail I shared. "Oh, Mara," she said when I'd finished, her voice heavy with sympathy and outrage. "How could she treat you like that? In your own home, no less." "I keep asking myself the same question," I admitted. "I thought I'd raised her better than that." Linda was quiet for a moment, rocking gently in her chair while she considered my story. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes people show us who they really are, and we have to decide whether we're going to keep pretending they're someone else." Her words hit me with unexpected force, crystallizing thoughts that had been forming in my mind all morning. For too long, I'd been making excuses for Jessica's behavior, explaining away her increasing selfishness and entitlement as temporary stress or professional pressure. But Christmas Eve had stripped away all the comfortable illusions I'd been maintaining about my daughter's character. "The thing is," I said slowly, "I don't think this was just about Kevin's boss or his career. I think this was about Jessica being embarrassed by me, by my house, by everything I represent." Linda nodded sadly. "Some people get so caught up in trying to impress others that they forget who really matters, but that doesn't make it hurt any less." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood children play with their new Christmas toys on the sidewalk. Their laughter and excitement felt like it belonged to a different world, one where families actually cared about each other, and Christmas meant something more than social advancement. "What are you going to do now?" Linda asked eventually. It was a question I'd been avoiding, but one that needed to be answered. What was I going to do? I could continue pretending that Christmas Eve had never happened, could go back to being the accommodating mother and grandmother who never rocked the boat. I could keep hosting family dinners and babysitting grandchildren and pretending that my daughter's treatment of me was acceptable. Or I could do something different. I could stop being the person who absorbed other people's cruelty without complaint and start being someone who demanded the respect I deserved. "I don't know yet," I told Linda honestly, "but I know I can't go back to the way things were before." She reached over and squeezed my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Whatever you decide, you know I'm here for you. You don't have to face this alone." Her support meant more to me than she could possibly know. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt like I wasn't completely isolated in my pain and confusion. Someone understood what I was going through. Someone validated my feelings and confirmed that I wasn't overreacting to Jessica's behavior. After Linda left, I spent the rest of Christmas Day alone with my thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened and figure out what came next. The house felt different somehow, as if Christmas Eve had changed not just my relationship with my family, but my relationship with my own home and my own sense of self. That evening, as I was preparing a simple dinner for one, my phone finally rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for several rings before deciding to answer. "Mom!" Her voice was bright and cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "How was your Christmas? I'm sorry we couldn't stop by, but Kevin's boss wanted to play golf this morning, and then we had that party at the Hendersons' house." I listened to her casual recounting of her day, noting how effortlessly she'd moved past the previous evening's events. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened, no apology for her treatment of me, no recognition that she'd done anything wrong at all. "That sounds nice," I said when she paused for breath. "Did you have a good time?" "Oh, it was wonderful. Mr. Davidson was so impressed with everything. He told Kevin that he's definitely being considered for that promotion. And everyone at the party was talking about how elegant our Christmas dinner was. I think it really made a difference that we kept things small and sophisticated." Small and sophisticated. The words stung, but I kept my voice neutral. "I'm glad it worked out for you. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you again for understanding about the dinner arrangement. I know it wasn't ideal, but you handled it so gracefully. That's what I've always loved about you, Mom. You're so flexible and accommodating." Flexible and accommodating. In other words, easy to manipulate and willing to accept whatever treatment they decided to give me. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Jessica chattering about her successful evening while I made appropriate responses at the right moments. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the call and what it revealed about my daughter's mindset. She genuinely believed that she'd done nothing wrong, that asking me to eat in the kitchen had been a reasonable request that any good mother would have accepted without complaint. The fact that it had humiliated and hurt me was irrelevant to her, as long as it had served her purposes. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to stop being flexible and accommodating. I decided to stop making excuses for people who treated me badly. And, most importantly, I decided to start paying attention to the things I'd been willfully ignoring about my daughter's life. Because something told me that Christmas Eve was just the beginning of a much larger story. One that would test everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. And this time, I was going to be ready. The days following Christmas passed in a strange blur of routine activities and internal revolution. I went through the motions of my normal life, tending to my garden, running errands, and maintaining my house, but everything felt different now. It was as if Christmas Eve had cracked open something inside me that I'd kept carefully sealed for decades, and now I couldn't pretend that the crack wasn't there. 3 days after Christmas, I was sorting through the mail when I found something that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the usual bills and advertisements was a letter addressed to me, but the return address was from Pacific Northwest Credit Union. I'd never had any accounts with that particular institution, so I opened it with curiosity that quickly turned to alarm. The letter was a notice about a loan application that had been submitted using my Social Security number and personal information. According to the document, someone had applied for a substantial personal loan using my name as a co-signer, and the bank was requesting additional documentation to verify my identity and income. The amount listed made my hands tremble as I read it again to make sure I wasn't seeing things wrong. $50,000. Someone had attempted to take out a $50,000 loan using my name and credit history as collateral. The application had been submitted electronically, and while it had been flagged for additional verification, the initial credit check had already been run against my accounts. I sat down heavily at my kitchen table, staring at the letter while my mind raced through the implications. Identity theft wasn't uncommon, but this felt different. This felt personal. Someone had access to detailed information about my financial situation, my Social Security number, my banking history, and my personal details. The kind of information that only someone very close to me would possess. My first instinct was to call the police, but something held me back. Instead, I called the credit union directly, speaking with a customer service representative who confirmed that the loan application had indeed been submitted using my information. The woman on the phone was professional but clearly concerned about the situation. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you some questions about this application," she said. "Are you familiar with the person who listed you as a co-signer? The primary applicant is listed as Jessica Walsh, and she indicated that you're her mother and that you've agreed to guarantee this loan." The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica. My own daughter had attempted to use my name and credit to secure a loan for $50,000 without my knowledge or consent. The betrayal was so complete, so stunning in its audacity, that I couldn't immediately process what I was hearing. "Mrs. Henderson? Are you still there?" "Yes," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I'm here. And no, I did not agree to co-sign any loan for my daughter. I had no knowledge of this application." The representative's tone became more serious. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Mrs. Henderson. This appears to be a case of identity theft or fraud. I'm going to need to flag this application immediately and begin the process of removing the credit inquiry from your report. You'll also need to file a police report and contact the other credit bureaus to place a fraud alert on your accounts." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the letter, trying to understand how my daughter could have done something so calculating and cruel. The Christmas Eve dinner suddenly took on a different meaning. Had that been part of a larger plan? Had Jessica been testing my boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with before moving on to more serious violations of trust? I thought about all the times over the past year when Jessica had asked seemingly innocent questions about my finances. How much was my house worth? Did I have a retirement account? What was my monthly income from Social Security? I'd answered these questions honestly, thinking she was just concerned about my financial security in my old age. Now I realized she'd been gathering information for something far more sinister. The phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. It was Jessica, her voice bright and cheerful as if nothing had happened. "Hi, Mom, how are you doing? I was just thinking about you, and thought I'd call to check in." I stared at the letter in my hand, this evidence of her attempted fraud. while she chatted pleasantly about her day. The disconnect between her casual tone and the gravity of what she'd done was almost surreal. "Jessica," I said, cutting off her rambling commentary about Emma's school project, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Her voice changed slightly, becoming more guarded. "Of course, Mom. What is it? Did you apply for a loan using my name as a co-signer?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could almost picture her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to respond. "Mom, I can explain," she said finally, her voice taking on that pleading tone she'd used as a child when she'd been caught doing something wrong. "It's not what you think. I was going to talk to you about it, but I wanted to make sure the loan was approved first. I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. You submitted a loan application using my social security number and personal information without my knowledge or consent," I said, my voice deadly calm. "That's called fraud, Jessica. It's a federal crime." "It's not fraud when it's family," she protested, her voice rising with panic. "I knew you'd want to help us. You always have before. And it's not like you can't afford it. Your house is paid off, you have savings, you get Social Security every month. This loan wouldn't hurt you at all." I closed my eyes, trying to process the twisted logic of her argument. In her mind, apparently, my financial resources belonged to her family, and she had the right to access them with or without my permission. The Christmas Eve dinner suddenly made perfect sense. She'd been testing whether I would resist her demands, whether I would stand up for myself or simply go along with whatever she wanted. "Jessica, what I can or can't afford is not the issue here. The issue is that you committed fraud using my identity. You could go to prison for this." "Prison?" Her voice cracked with fear. "Mom, you can't be serious. I'm your daughter. You wouldn't turn me into the police over something like this." "Something like this?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You committed identity theft against your own mother. You violated my trust in the most fundamental way possible. And you did it right after humiliating me in my own home on Christmas Eve." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Jessica alternating between defensive anger and desperate pleading. She tried to explain that they were facing financial difficulties, that Kevin's job was less secure than they'd pretended, that they needed the money to maintain their lifestyle and keep up appearances. She talked about Tyler's college expenses, about Emma's private school tuition, about the mortgage payments and credit card bills that were becoming unmanageable. But what struck me most was her complete inability to acknowledge the wrongness of what she'd done. Even when caught red-handed, she continued to act as if she'd been justified in her actions, as if my financial resources were community property that she had the right to access whenever she needed them. "I'm going to hang up now," I said when her explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory. "I need time to think about this." "Mom, please don't do anything rash," she begged. "We can work this out. I'll withdraw the loan application. We can pretend this never happened." "But it did happen, Jessica. And pretending otherwise isn't going to make it go away." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, feeling like I was seeing my daughter clearly for the first time in years. The woman who had attempted to defraud me was the same person who had banished me to the kitchen on Christmas Eve, who had been asking probing questions about my finances, who had been gradually testing my boundaries to see how much she could get away with. I thought about Kevin's nervous behavior during Christmas dinner, about the way he'd avoided eye contact with me, about the conversation I'd overheard regarding his job security. I wondered how much he knew about Jessica's plan to use my credit, whether he'd been a willing participant or simply another victim of her desperation. The next morning, I called Linda and asked her to come over. I needed to talk to someone I trusted, someone who could help me think through the implications of what I'd discovered. When she arrived, I showed her the letter and told her about my phone conversation with Jessica. Linda's reaction was immediate and fierce. "That little witch," she said, her voice trembling with outrage. "How dare she do this to you? And right after Christmas Eve, too. It's like she was testing to see how much abuse you'd take before you fought back." "That's exactly what I think she was doing," I said. "I think Christmas Eve was a test. And when I passed it by not standing up for myself, she decided I was weak enough to steal from." Linda paced around my kitchen, her anger radiating from every step. "You have to turn her in, Mara. I know she's your daughter, but this is serious. If you don't report this, she'll just keep escalating." Next time it might be your house, or your bank accounts, or something even worse. I knew Linda was right, but the thought of filing a police report against my own daughter felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about family loyalty and maternal love. Despite everything Jessica had done to me, she was still my child, still the little girl I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. "I keep thinking about when she was small," I said. "She was such a sweet child, always trying to help, always wanting to make me proud. I don't understand how that little girl turned into someone who could do this to me." Linda sat down beside me and took my hand. "Sometimes people change, honey. Sometimes the children we raise become adults we don't recognize. But that doesn't mean we have to enable their bad behavior or let them destroy our lives." Over the next few days, I found myself paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. I started noticing the expensive clothes Jessica wore to family gatherings, the designer handbags that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, the casual way she and Kevin talked about expensive vacations and luxury purchases. I began to understand that their financial problems weren't the result of unexpected hardship, but of lifestyle choices they couldn't actually afford. I also started remembering conversations from the past year with new clarity. Jessica's increased interest in my financial situation, her subtle suggestions that I should consider moving to a smaller place or liquidating some of my assets, her comments about how much money I was wasting on maintaining a house that was too big for one person. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Jessica had been laying the groundwork for this fraud for months. She'd been gathering information, testing my boundaries, and gradually conditioning me to accept her increasing demands on my resources and my compliance. But what troubled me most was the realization that I'd been complicit in my own victimization. I'd been so eager to maintain family harmony, so willing to excuse Jessica's behavior and give her the benefit of the doubt, that I'd ignored obvious warning signs and made myself vulnerable to her manipulation. The phone calls from Jessica continued over the next several days, each one more desperate than the last. She tried different approaches, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes attempting to guilt me into compliance by talking about the grandchildren and how this would affect them. But underneath all her emotional manipulation, I could hear the same fundamental assumption that had driven her behavior all along. That I existed to serve her needs, that my resources were hers to command, and that my feelings and dignity were irrelevant compared to her wants and desires. On New Year's Eve, exactly 1 week after Christmas Eve, I made the decision that would change everything. I was sitting in my living room, watching the preparations for the Times Square celebration on television, when I realized that I was facing a choice that would define not just my relationship with Jessica, but my own sense of self-worth and dignity. I could continue being the accommodating mother who absorbed abuse and enabled bad behavior in the name of family harmony. I could pretend that the attempted fraud had never happened, accept Jessica's promises to do better, and go back to being the person who ate in the kitchen while others enjoyed the fruits of my labor. Or I could choose to be someone different, someone who demanded respect, who refused to be taken advantage of, who understood that enabling destructive behavior wasn't love but a form of harm that hurt everyone involved. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the Riverside Police Department. When the dispatcher answered, I took a deep breath and said the words that would change my life forever. "I need to report a case of identity theft and fraud. The perpetrator is my daughter, and I have documentation of her attempts to use my personal information to obtain a loan without my consent." The process of filing the police report was both easier and harder than I'd expected. The officer who came to my house was professional and sympathetic, clearly understanding that this was a difficult situation for me. He explained that identity theft cases involving family members were unfortunately common, and that my decision to report it was both legally necessary and personally courageous. "I know this is hard, Mrs. Henderson," he said as he filled out the paperwork, "but you're doing the right thing. If you don't establish boundaries now, this behavior will only escalate. Your daughter needs to face consequences for her actions, and you need to protect yourself from further financial harm." I gave him copies of all the documentation I'd received from the credit union, along with a written statement detailing my conversations with Jessica, and my certainty that she was responsible for the fraudulent loan application. The officer assured me that the case would be investigated thoroughly, and that I would be contacted as the investigation progressed. After he left, I sat in my living room, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. I had crossed a line that I could never uncross, had made a decision that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my daughter, and possibly my entire family. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was acting with integrity, rather than simply reacting to other people's demands and expectations. The phone rang less than an hour later. It was Jessica, her voice shaking with panic and rage. "Mom, what have you done? The police just called Kevin at work. They said you filed a report against me for identity theft. How could you do this to me? I'm your daughter." "Yes, you are my daughter," I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. "And that makes what you did even worse. You violated my trust in the most fundamental way possible, and you did it without any consideration for how it would affect me. I can't believe you turned me in to the police like some kind of criminal. I was gonna pay back the loan. I was gonna take care of everything. You didn't have to involve the authorities." Jessica, using someone else's identity to obtain credit is a crime, whether you're related to them or not. And the fact that you're my daughter doesn't give you the right to steal from me. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Jessica alternating between threats and pleading, between anger and desperation. She talked about how this would ruin her reputation, how Kevin might lose his job if word got out, how the children would be affected by having a mother with a criminal record. But she never once acknowledged the wrongness of what she'd done. Even facing potential criminal charges, she continued to act as if she'd been justified in her actions, as if I had somehow betrayed her by refusing to be a victim of her fraud. "This is all because of Christmas Eve, isn't it?" she said finally, her voice taking on a bitter edge. "You're doing this to punish me for asking you to eat in the kitchen. You're using this loan thing as an excuse to get revenge." "No, Jessica," I said quietly. "I'm doing this because you committed a crime against me, and because you need to face the consequences of your actions. Christmas Eve showed me who you really are, but this fraud is what forced me to act." "Fine," she said, her voice cold with anger. "But don't expect me to forgive you for this. You've destroyed our family over money. I hope you're happy." After she hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about her final words. She was right about one thing. I had destroyed our family, but it wasn't over money, and it wasn't because of some petty desire for revenge. I destroyed the version of our family that was built on my willingness to accept abuse and enable bad behavior. I destroyed the dynamic that required me to be invisible, accommodating, and expendable. And despite the pain and uncertainty that lay ahead, I realized that I was happy. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living with integrity, standing up for myself and refusing to be a victim of other people's selfishness and cruelty. The old Mara would have swept this under the rug, would have prioritized family harmony over personal dignity, would have continued enabling Jessica's destructive behavior in the name of maternal love. But the new Mara, the one who had been born in the humiliation of Christmas Eve dinner, understood that real love sometimes required difficult choices and painful consequences. As I prepared for bed that New Year's Eve, I thought about the year ahead and the challenges it would bring. There would be court dates and family conflicts, difficult conversations and painful realizations. But there would also be self-respect, dignity, and the knowledge that I'd finally chosen to value myself enough to demand better treatment from the people who claimed to love me. The identity theft case was just the beginning. Over the next few days, as I continued to investigate my daughter's activities and piece together the full scope of her deception, I would discover that the attempted loan fraud was merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. Jessica and Kevin's financial problems were far more serious than I'd imagined, and their willingness to exploit me was more extensive than I'd ever dreamed possible. But I was no longer the same person who had quietly accepted humiliation on Christmas Eve. I was someone who had chosen to fight back, to demand accountability, and to refuse to be a victim of other people's greed and manipulation. And as I would soon discover, that decision would have consequences that none of us could have anticipated. The investigation into Jessica's financial activities began 3 days after I filed the police report. But my own detective work had already uncovered disturbing patterns that went far beyond the attempted loan fraud. I spent those January mornings going through years of documents, bank statements, and correspondence that I'd kept in my filing cabinet, looking for signs of the deception that had apparently been building for months. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about my daughter's life. Hidden among my tax documents were copies of forms that Jessica had helped me prepare over the past 2 years. Forms that I now realized contained subtle alterations to my reported income and asset values. She had been gradually inflating my financial worth on paper, creating a documentation trail that would support larger loan applications and credit requests. I discovered that Jessica had been intercepting some of my mail, including bank statements and credit card offers that I'd assumed were simply lost or misdirected. She'd been building a comprehensive picture of my financial situation while simultaneously creating false documentation that made me appear wealthier than I actually was. The sophistication of her deception was both impressive and terrifying. My investigation was interrupted by a call from Detective Sarah Morrison, the officer assigned to my case. Her voice was professional but warm, and I could tell she understood the emotional complexity of investigating one's own family member. "Mrs. Henderson, I wanted to update you on the progress of our investigation," she said. "We've confirmed that the loan application was indeed submitted using your personal information without your consent. We've also discovered that this wasn't the first attempt. Your daughter has been making inquiries about your credit and financial status with several different institutions over the past 6 months." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't been acting impulsively or desperately when she'd submitted the loan application. She'd been systematically researching my financial situation, testing different approaches, and building up to increasingly serious violations of my privacy and trust. "How many institutions are we talking about?" I asked, dreading the answer. "At least 4 different banks and credit unions, plus several online lending platforms. Most of these inquiries were preliminary, but they show a pattern of behavior that suggests this was planned over an extended period." Detective Morrison explained that they'd also found evidence of Jessica accessing my personal information through various means, including using my social security number to request credit reports and contacting my bank to inquire about my account balances. The scope of her activities was staggering, and I realized that the Christmas Eve dinner had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle. "We're going to need you to come in and review all the documentation we've collected," Detective Morrison continued. "I want to make sure we have a complete picture of what happened before we proceed with formal charges." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process the magnitude of Jessica's deception. This wasn't a moment of weakness or desperation. This was a calculated campaign of financial stalking that had been going on for months. She'd been treating me like a mark, a target to be studied and exploited rather than a mother to be loved and respected. The phone rang again, and this time it was Kevin. His voice was strained and defensive, carrying none of the casual friendliness he'd shown during our previous conversations. "Mara, we need to talk about this situation with Jessica," he said without preamble. "This whole thing has gotten completely out of hand." "Has it?" I replied, surprised by the steady tone of my own voice. "I think filing false loan applications and stealing someone's identity is pretty serious from the beginning. Look, I know Jessica made some mistakes, but involving the police was unnecessary. We're family. We should be able to work this out among ourselves." I found myself wondering how much Kevin had known about Jessica's activities, how much he'd been a willing participant versus an unwitting beneficiary of her fraud attempts. His tone suggested he was more concerned about the consequences than the actions themselves. "Kevin, your wife committed multiple felonies using my personal information. This isn't a family disagreement that can be resolved over coffee. This is a criminal matter that requires legal consequences." "Criminal matter?" His voice rose with panic. "Mara, you can't seriously be planning to press charges against your own daughter. Think about Tyler and Emma. Think about what this will do to them." The mention of my grandchildren was clearly intended to manipulate me, to make me feel guilty for protecting myself from their mother's criminal behavior. But I'd learned to recognize these tactics now, and they no longer had the power to override my judgment. "I am thinking about Tyler and Emma," I said firmly. "I'm thinking about what kind of lesson it teaches them if their mother faces no consequences for committing crimes against her own family. I'm thinking about what kind of adults they'll become if they learn that family relationships excuse fraud and theft." Kevin's response revealed the depth of the financial crisis that had driven Jessica's desperate actions. Their mortgage was 3 months behind, their credit cards were maxed out, and Kevin's job at the dealership was hanging by a thread due to poor sales performance and customer complaints. The expensive lifestyle they'd been maintaining was built entirely on borrowed money and false pretenses. "We're going to lose the house," Kevin said, his voice breaking with desperation. "The bank is starting foreclosure proceedings. Jessica thought if she could get a loan using your credit, we could catch up on the payments and buy some time to get back on our feet." "So your solution was to destroy my credit and put me at risk for $50,000 in debt?" I asked. "Did either of you consider the possibility that I might not be able to pay back money I never agreed to borrow?" "Your house is worth 3 times that amount," Kevin replied, revealing the extent of their calculations. "Even if something went wrong, you had the assets to cover it. We figured it was safer to risk your financial security than to lose everything we'd worked for." The casual way he admitted to calculating the risks to my financial well-being, while protecting their own interests, was breathtaking in its selfishness. They'd been willing to gamble with my life savings, my credit rating, and my financial security to maintain their unsustainable lifestyle. "Kevin, I'm going to hang up now," I said. "And I'm going to suggest that you and Jessica hire a lawyer, because this situation is not going to simply disappear." The next morning brought a visit from Tyler, my 17-year-old grandson. I hadn't seen him since Christmas Eve, and the change in his demeanor was immediately apparent. Gone was the typical teenage indifference he'd shown during family gatherings. Instead, he seemed genuinely distressed and confused. "Grandma Mara, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice carrying a maturity I'd never heard before. "Mom and Dad are saying you're trying to send Mom to jail. That can't be true, right?" I invited him into my kitchen and made him hot chocolate, the same way I'd done when he was a small child coming to visit. But this conversation would be nothing like the innocent chatter we'd shared during those earlier visits. "Tyler, your mother committed fraud using my identity," I said gently. "She tried to take out a loan for $50,000 using my personal information without my knowledge or permission. That's a serious crime." He stared at me for a long moment, processing this information. "But she's your daughter. Can't you just not press charges? Can't you work it out? Would you want someone to steal your identity and ruin your credit, even if that person was related to you?" I asked. "Would you think it was okay if someone you trusted used your personal information to get money without asking you first?" Tyler was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the moral complexity of the situation. Finally, he spoke again, his voice small and uncertain. "Things have been really bad at home lately," he admitted. "Mom and Dad fight all the time about money. They think I don't know, but I hear them arguing after I go to bed. Dad lost his job last month, but they haven't told anyone because they're embarrassed." This was new information that explained even more about the desperation behind Jessica's actions. Kevin hadn't just been facing job insecurity, he'd actually been terminated from his position at the dealership. The expensive lifestyle they'd been maintaining was now being funded entirely by credit cards and borrowed money. "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "I know this is hard to understand, but sometimes people we love make bad choices, and those choices have consequences." Tyler nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I found some papers in Dad's study a few weeks ago. Legal documents about the house, about money they owe. I didn't understand most of it, but I knew it was bad. Is that why Mom tried to use your credit?" "Probably," I said. "But Tyler, their financial problems don't excuse what your mother did. There are legal ways to get help when you're in trouble, and there are family members who would have listened if they'd been honest about their situation." "Would you have helped them if they'd asked?" He wanted to know. It was a question I'd been asking myself since this whole situation began. Would I have been willing to help Jessica and Kevin if they'd come to me honestly, explained their situation, and asked for assistance? The answer was probably yes, but with conditions and limitations that they clearly hadn't wanted to accept. "I might have," I said honestly. "But I would have wanted to understand exactly what kind of help they needed, and I would have expected them to be completely truthful about their situation. I also would have expected them to treat me with respect and dignity, not like someone who existed solely to solve their problems." Tyler spent another hour with me, asking questions about the legal process and trying to understand the implications of his mother's actions. He was clearly struggling with the realization that his parents weren't the responsible adults he'd believed them to be. and that their family's comfortable lifestyle had been built on financial deception. "Grandma Mara, I'm scared," he said as he prepared to leave. "What's going to happen to us? Where will we live if we lose the house? What about Emma's school?" I felt my heart break for him, for the position his parents had put him in through their poor choices and criminal behavior. But I also knew that protecting him from the consequences of their actions wouldn't help him in the long run. "I don't know what will happen with your parents, Tyler," I said. "But I want you to know that you and Emma are not responsible for their choices. You didn't cause this situation, and you can't fix it. The only thing you can control is how you respond to it." After Tyler left, I called Linda to update her on the latest developments. She listened to my account of the conversation with Kevin and the visit from Tyler, her anger growing with each detail I shared. "Those people have no shame," she said when I finished. "They commit crimes against you, and then they send that poor boy to guilt you into dropping the charges. It's emotional manipulation at its worst." "I don't think Tyler was trying to manipulate me," I said. "I think he's genuinely confused and scared. He's trying to understand how his family fell apart so quickly." "Maybe not Tyler," Linda conceded, "but his parents certainly are. Using their own children as messengers to pressure you into dropping criminal charges is despicable." That evening, I received a call from Detective Morrison with an update on the investigation. The news was worse than I'd expected. "Mrs. Henderson, we've discovered additional fraudulent activities involving your personal information," she said. "Your daughter has been using your Social Security number to open credit card accounts and make purchases online. We've identified at least 3 different cards that were opened in your name over the past 4 months." The revelation was staggering. Jessica hadn't just attempted to secure one loan using my identity. She'd been systematically opening credit accounts and making purchases, building up debt that would eventually be traced back to me. The sophistication and scope of her fraud were far beyond anything I'd imagined. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The total debt accumulated across all the fraudulent accounts is approximately $28,000, Detective Morrison replied. "Most of this was spent on clothing, home goods, and what appear to be luxury items. We're working with the credit card companies to reverse these charges, but it's going to take time." $28,000. Jessica had stolen nearly $30,000 using my identity, money that had been spent on maintaining the lifestyle she couldn't afford through legitimate means. The audacity of her theft was matched only by the callousness of her willingness to destroy my financial security for her own benefit. "There's something else," Detective Morrison continued. "We found evidence that your daughter has been researching your estate planning documents. She's been trying to determine the extent of your assets and the terms of your will." The implication was chilling. Jessica hadn't just been stealing from me in the present. She'd been planning for how to maximize her inheritance from my eventual death. The woman who had banished me to the kitchen on Christmas Eve had been calculating the financial value of my demise. "We're going to need to expand our investigation," Detective Morrison said. "This case now involves multiple felony charges across several jurisdictions. Your daughter is facing serious prison time if convicted on all counts." After I hung up, I sat in my living room trying to process the magnitude of Jessica's betrayal. This wasn't just fraud. It was a systematic campaign of financial abuse that had been building for months. She'd been treating me like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected, and she'd been doing it with a level of calculation that was truly frightening. The phone rang again, and this time it was Emma, my 14-year-old granddaughter. Her voice was small and frightened, and I could tell she'd been crying. "Grandma Mara, Tyler told me what happened with Mom and the police," she said. "He said Mom might have to go to jail. Is that true?" "It's possible, sweetheart," I said gently. "Your mother made some very serious mistakes, and now she has to face the consequences. But why would she steal from you? You're her mom. You love her." Emma's question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Why would Jessica steal from me? Why would she risk destroying our relationship and her own future for money? The answer was complex and painful, involving years of entitlement, financial pressure, and moral compromise. Sometimes people make bad choices when they're scared or desperate. I said. And sometimes people start thinking of other people's things as their own, especially when they believe they deserve those things. Are you going to forgive her? Emma asked. Even if she has to go to jail? Forgiving someone doesn't mean letting them avoid consequences for their actions, I said. I love your mother, but I can't pretend that what she did was okay. If I don't hold her accountable, she'll never learn to make better choices. Emma was quiet for a long moment. I'm scared, Grandma. What if Mom goes to jail? What if Dad can't find another job? What if we lose our house? I'm scared too, sweetheart, I said honestly. But we'll figure it out. Whatever happens, you and Tyler will be okay. I promise you that. After Emma hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation and the promises I'd made. I'd told my granddaughter that everything would be okay, but I wasn't sure that was true. Their family was falling apart, their financial situation was desperate, and their mother was facing serious criminal charges. But I also knew that I'd made the right decision in reporting Jessica's crimes. The alternative would have been to enable her destructive behavior, to teach my grandchildren that family relationships excuse fraud and theft, and to sacrifice my own financial security for people who viewed me as a resource rather than a person. The next morning brought a visit from Jessica herself, the first time I'd seen her since Christmas Eve. She looked terrible, her usually perfect appearance replaced by obvious signs of stress and sleeplessness. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her hair was unkempt, and her eyes were red from crying. Mom, please, she said as soon as I opened the door. We need to talk. You have to help me fix this. I let her into my living room, but I didn't offer her coffee or try to make her comfortable. This wasn't a social visit. This was a confrontation between a criminal and her victim. There's nothing to fix, Jessica, I said. You committed crimes against me, and now you're facing the consequences. The only thing you can do is accept responsibility for your actions and try to make amends. Make amends? She laughed bitterly. Mom, I'm looking at 15 years in prison. My children are going to grow up with a mother in jail. Kevin will probably divorce me. We're going to lose everything. You should have thought about those consequences before you decided to steal from me, I said. You should have thought about your children before you chose to commit fraud instead of asking for help. I couldn't ask for help, Jessica exploded. Don't you understand? Everyone thinks we're successful. Everyone looks up to us. If word got out that we were struggling financially, it would ruin Kevin's career and destroy our reputation. So instead, you decided to destroy my credit and steal $30,000 from me? I asked. You decided that your reputation was more important than my financial security? Jessica stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling to find an argument that would justify her actions. Finally, she spoke again, her voice taking on the manipulative tone I'd learned to recognize. Mom, I know you're hurt, and I understand why you're angry. But if you really loved me, you'd drop these charges. You'd help me get through this difficult time instead of making everything worse. If you really loved me, you wouldn't have stolen from me, I replied. You wouldn't have violated my trust and put me at financial risk. You wouldn't have treated me like a resource to be exploited. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jessica alternating between different emotional appeals and logical arguments. She tried guilt, anger, desperation, and even threats. But nothing could change the fundamental facts of the situation. She'd committed serious crimes against me, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. When she finally left, I felt emotionally drained but also oddly relieved. I'd faced down my daughter's manipulation and maintained my resolve to hold her accountable for her actions. For the first time in our relationship, I'd refused to be the accommodating mother who absorbed abuse and enabled bad behavior. The investigation continued over the following weeks, revealing even more disturbing details about Jessica's activities. She'd been planning to use my identity to refinance my house, potentially putting my home ownership at risk. She'd been researching ways to access my retirement accounts, and had even made inquiries about obtaining power of attorney over my affairs. The scope of her intended fraud was breathtaking, suggesting that she'd been planning to systematically strip me of my assets while maintaining the pretense of being a loving daughter. The Christmas Eve dinner now seemed like a test run, a way to gauge my willingness to accept mistreatment and subordination. As the evidence mounted and the legal process moved forward, I found myself experiencing a strange mixture of grief and relief. I was grieving the loss of the daughter I'd thought I had, the woman I'd believed Jessica to be. But I was also relieved to finally understand the truth about our relationship, and to have taken steps to protect myself from further abuse. The investigation phase was drawing to a close, and I knew that soon Jessica would be facing formal charges that could result in significant prison time. The confrontation that had begun with a humiliating Christmas Eve dinner was about to reach its climax in a courtroom, where the truth about my daughter's character would be revealed for everyone to see. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in late February, exactly 2 months after I'd filed the police report. I was tending to my indoor plants when the phone rang, and Detective Morrison's voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Mrs. Henderson, we need to talk immediately," she said. "Something's happened that complicates the case significantly. Your daughter and son-in-law were arrested last night on additional charges that go far beyond the identity theft." My hands trembled as I set down my watering can. "What kind of charges?" "Money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. It appears they've been running a sophisticated scheme involving multiple victims, not just you. Can you come to the station this morning? We need to discuss how this affects your case, and what we've discovered about their activities." The drive to the police station felt surreal. I'd thought Jessica's fraud against me was a desperate act born of financial pressure, but Detective Morrison's tone suggested something far more serious and calculated. The woman I'd raised, the mother of my grandchildren, was apparently involved in criminal activities that extended well beyond stealing from her own mother. Detective Morrison met me in the lobby, her expression grave. She led me to a small conference room where files and documents covered every surface. The scope of the investigation was immediately apparent from the sheer volume of evidence they'd assembled. "Mrs. Henderson, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear," she began. "Your daughter and her husband have been operating a fraud ring for over 3 years. They've been targeting elderly clients at various businesses, stealing personal information and using it to obtain credit and loans. The attempted fraud against you was just one of many similar schemes they've been running." The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't been acting out of desperation or making impulsive bad choices. She'd been operating as a professional criminal, systematically targeting vulnerable people for financial exploitation. The fact that she'd eventually turned those criminal skills against her own mother was both inevitable and heartbreaking. "How many victims are we talking about?" I asked, dreading the answer. "At least 37 confirmed cases over the past 3 years," Detective Morrison replied. "The total amount stolen is approaching $500,000. Your daughter was particularly skilled at identifying elderly targets who had good credit but limited technical knowledge to detect the fraud quickly." She showed me photographs of documents they'd seized from Jessica's home office, including detailed profiles of potential victims with their personal information, credit scores, and asset evaluations. The level of organization was staggering, resembling a legitimate business operation more than random criminal activity. "We found your file among their records," Detective Morrison continued, opening a folder that made my stomach turn. "They'd been researching you for over a year, documenting your financial situation, your daily routines, and your relationships with family members. They even had photographs of your house and notes about your security habits." The file contained copies of my bank statements, credit reports, and even medical records that Jessica had somehow obtained. They documented my grocery shopping patterns, my church attendance, and my friendship with Linda. The invasion of privacy was so complete and systematic that it felt like a violation of my very identity. "There's more," Detective Morrison said, her voice becoming even more serious. "We have evidence that they were planning to escalate their exploitation of you significantly. They had drafted documents to obtain power of attorney over your affairs, and they'd researched the process for having you declared mentally incompetent." The revelation was so shocking that I couldn't immediately process it. Jessica hadn't just been planning to steal my money, she'd been planning to take control of my entire life. The woman who had banished me to the kitchen on Christmas Eve had been preparing to have me declared mentally unfit so she could legally steal everything I owned. "The Christmas Eve dinner now makes perfect sense," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She was testing whether I would resist her demands, whether I had the strength to stand up for myself. If I'd been completely compliant, she probably would have moved forward with the power of attorney scheme. Detective Morrison nodded grimly. That's exactly what we think happened. The way you handled that situation probably saved you from much more serious financial harm. Your resistance likely forced them to accelerate their timeline and move to more desperate measures. She explained that Jessica and Kevin had been arrested during a raid on their home, where police had found extensive evidence of their criminal enterprise. Kevin had been operating as the technical specialist, using his access to customer information from various businesses to identify potential targets. Jessica had been the one who made contact with victims, using her charm and apparent respectability to gain their trust. We've recovered computers, files, and financial records that document their entire operation, Detective Morrison continued. They kept detailed records of every fraud they committed, including notes about which approaches worked best with different types of victims. The methodical nature of their criminality was almost more disturbing than the crimes themselves. They'd treated fraud as a business, with target demographics, success metrics, and strategic planning. The fact that they'd eventually targeted me suggested either desperation or a complete moral collapse that made family relationships irrelevant to their criminal calculations. What happens now? I asked. They're both being held without bail due to the flight risk and the seriousness of the charges, Detective Morrison explained. The federal prosecutor is building a case that could result in decades in prison for both of them. You'll need to testify about your experiences, but you'll also be recognized as a victim in a much larger criminal enterprise. The drive home from the police station was a blur of conflicting emotions. I felt vindicated in my decision to report Jessica's crimes, but also devastated by the scope of her criminal activities. The daughter I'd raised had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of systematic cruelty against vulnerable people. When I arrived home, Tyler was sitting on my front porch, his face streaked with tears. He looked up at me with an expression of complete devastation, and I knew he'd heard about his parents' arrest. "Grandma Mara, they're saying Mom and Dad are criminals," he said, his voice breaking. "They're saying they stole money from old people, that they were running some kind of scam. It can't be true, can it?" I sat beside him on the porch steps, the same place where I'd made so many decisions over the past months. "I'm afraid it is true, Tyler. Your parents have been involved in criminal activities for several years." "But why?" he asked, his voice filled with anguish. "We had a good life. We had a nice house, good schools, everything we needed. Why would they risk all of that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Sometimes people make choices that don't make sense to anyone else. Sometimes they want more than they can legitimately afford, and they convince themselves that stealing is justified if it maintains their lifestyle." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "The police took everything," he said finally. "They seized the house, the cars, even Emma's computer. They said it was all bought with stolen money." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Tyler and Emma weren't just facing the possibility of their parents going to prison. They were facing the complete collapse of their world. Everything they'd believed about their family's success and stability had been built on criminal activity. "Where are you and Emma staying?" I asked. "With the Johnsons for now," he said, referring to family friends who lived across town. "But I don't think that's going to work long term. Emma's having nightmares, and she keeps asking when Mom and Dad are coming home. I made a decision that surprised even me." "You and Emma can stay here," I said. "I have a spare bedroom, and we can figure out arrangements for Emma. You shouldn't have to live with the uncertainty of temporary housing while dealing with everything else." Tyler's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. "Are you sure? After everything Mom and Dad did to you?" "You and Emma didn't do anything wrong," I said firmly. "You're not responsible for your parents' choices, and you shouldn't have to suffer because of them. You're my grandchildren, and I love you." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as I prepared my home for two traumatized teenagers. I converted my sewing room into a bedroom for Emma and set up the guest room for Tyler. More importantly, I had to help them process the reality of their parents' criminal activities and the likelihood that both Jessica and Kevin would be spending years in prison. Emma's reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking. At 14, she was old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation, but young enough to still believe in the fundamental goodness of her parents. She struggled with the cognitive dissonance of loving people who had committed terrible crimes against innocent victims. "I don't understand how Mom could steal from old people," she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen. "She always taught us to be kind to elderly people, to respect them and help them. How could she do the opposite of what she taught us?" "Sometimes people don't live according to the values they claim to hold," I said. "Sometimes they justify bad behavior by telling themselves that their needs are more important than other people's well-being." Tyler's response was different, but equally painful. He'd reached the age where he was beginning to understand the complexity of adult relationships and moral choices, and he was struggling with the realization that his parents were fundamentally different people than he'd believed them to be. "I keep thinking about all the times they lectured me about honesty and responsibility," he said, "about how important it was to work hard and earn what you have. It was all lies, wasn't it? Everything they taught us about right and wrong was meaningless because they didn't believe it themselves." "It wasn't meaningless," I said. "The values they taught you are still important, even if they didn't live up to them. You get to choose whether you follow those values or repeat their mistakes." The media attention began shortly after Jessica and Kevin's arrest became public. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the fraud ring, and television reporters began calling to request interviews. The story had all the elements that made for compelling news: wealthy suburbanites living double lives, elderly victims, and a criminal enterprise that had operated for years without detection. I declined all interview requests, not wanting to add to the spectacle that was already consuming my family's privacy. But I couldn't prevent the neighbors from talking, and within days everyone in Riverside knew about the Henderson family's criminal activities. The social consequences for Tyler and Emma were immediate and cruel. Some of their classmates treated them as celebrities, fascinated by the drama and asking intrusive questions about their parents' crimes. Others treated them as pariahs, as if criminality was contagious and associating with them might be dangerous. "I don't want to go to school anymore," Emma said one morning, her eyes red from crying. "Everyone stares at me, and yesterday someone asked if I knew how to steal credit cards like my mom. I can't take it anymore." "We'll figure out alternatives," I promised. "Maybe we can look into homeschooling options, or transferring to a different school district. You don't have to endure that kind of treatment." The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Jessica and Kevin's cases were consolidated with the broader federal investigation into their fraud ring, and prosecutors were eager to make an example of criminals who had systematically targeted vulnerable elderly victims. I received a call from the federal prosecutor's office requesting my participation in victim impact statements. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chen, explained that my testimony would be crucial in demonstrating the personal devastation caused by Jessica and Kevin's criminal activities. "Mrs. Henderson, your case is unique because it involves family members victimizing their own relative," she said. "It demonstrates a level of moral corruption that goes beyond simple financial crime. Your testimony will help the court understand the full scope of the harm they've caused." I agreed to testify, understanding that my participation might help ensure that Jessica and Kevin faced appropriate consequences for their actions. But I also knew that testifying against my own daughter would be one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. The weeks leading up to the sentencing hearing were emotionally exhausting. I had to review all the evidence of Jessica's crimes against me, reliving the humiliation of Christmas Eve and the discovery of her systematic fraud. I had to prepare statements about the financial and emotional impact of her actions, quantifying the harm she'd caused to my life and well-being. But perhaps most difficult was watching Tyler and Emma struggle with the reality that their parents would likely be incarcerated for many years. They were grieving the loss of the family they'd thought they had, while simultaneously trying to build new lives with me. "I'm scared about the future," Tyler confided one evening. "What if I turn out like them? What if I have the same moral weaknesses that let them justify stealing from innocent people?" "You won't," I said with certainty. "You're already showing more moral courage than your parents ever did. You're facing the truth about their actions instead of making excuses for them. That's the difference between people who learn from mistakes and people who repeat them." The night before the sentencing hearing, I lay awake, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. It had started with a humiliating Christmas Eve dinner, progressed through the discovery of systematic fraud, and culminated in the revelation that my daughter was a career criminal who had victimized dozens of innocent people. But it had also been a journey of personal growth and moral courage. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to demand respect, and to refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it came from people I loved. I'd discovered that real love sometimes required difficult choices and painful consequences. Tomorrow I would face Jessica in court one final time. I would tell the judge about the woman who had banished me to the kitchen on Christmas Eve, who had stolen my identity and attempted to destroy my financial security, who had planned to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could steal everything I owned. But I would also be speaking for all the other victims, the elderly people who had trusted Jessica and Kevin and been betrayed by that trust. I would be speaking for the principle that actions have consequences, that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior, and that justice matters more than maintaining comfortable illusions. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for months. Tomorrow would bring the conclusion of this painful chapter in my life, but it would also mark the beginning of a new chapter built on honesty, dignity, and the hard-won knowledge that I was strong enough to protect myself and the people I loved from those who would harm us. The federal courthouse in Portland was packed with victims and their families when I walked through the metal detectors that morning. Many of the faces in the gallery belonged to elderly people who had trusted Jessica and Kevin, only to discover that their kindness had been repaid with theft and deception. I recognized Mrs. Patterson from the neighborhood, whose retirement savings had been decimated by their schemes. Mr. and Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, holding hands as they waited to see justice served for the crime that had cost them their home. As I took my seat in the witness section, I caught sight of Jessica and Kevin at the defendant's table. They looked nothing like the confident, successful couple who had attended my Christmas Eve dinner just months ago. Prison uniforms had replaced designer clothes, and the stress of incarceration had aged them both considerably. Jessica's hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hands shook as she turned the pages of legal documents. Judge Williams called the court to order, and the sentencing hearing began with prosecutor Sarah Chen presenting the full scope of the fraud ring's activities. The numbers were staggering: 39 confirmed victims, over $600,000 stolen, and a criminal enterprise that had operated with ruthless efficiency for nearly 4 years. "Your Honor," Chen said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "this case represents more than simple financial crime. It represents a systematic assault on the trust and dignity of our community's most vulnerable members. The defendants targeted elderly victims, specifically because they believed these individuals would be less likely to detect the fraud quickly or fight back effectively." When my turn came to address the court, I walked to the podium feeling the weight of every decision I'd made since Christmas Eve. The judge looked down at me with kind eyes, and I saw some of the other victims nodding encouragingly from their seats. "Your Honor, my name is Mara Henderson, and Jessica Walsh is my daughter," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "For 73 years I believed that family meant something sacred, that the people we love and raise would treat us with basic dignity and respect. I was wrong about my daughter, but I was right about the importance of standing up for what's right. I spoke about Christmas Eve, about the humiliation of being banished to my own kitchen, while Jessica entertained people she considered more important than her own mother. I described the discovery of her fraud attempts, the violation of my privacy, and the revelation that she had planned to have me declared mentally incompetent. But I'm not standing here today just for myself," I continued. "I'm standing here for every elderly person who trusted these defendants and was betrayed by that trust. I'm standing here for my grandchildren, who need to learn that actions have consequences, and that love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior." The judge listened intently as I finished my statement. When I returned to my seat, I felt Tyler squeeze my hand from where he sat beside me. Emma was crying quietly, but she managed a small smile when I looked at her. Other victims followed with their statements, each one painting a picture of the devastation Jessica and Kevin had caused. Mrs. Patterson spoke about losing her life savings and having to move in with her adult children. Mr. Chen described the shame of telling his family that their inheritance was gone, stolen by people he had trusted. When the prosecutor finished presenting the victim impact statements, Jessica's attorney stood to make his plea for leniency. He spoke about her difficult childhood, her struggles with financial pressure, and her role as a mother of 2 teenage children. But his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence and the testimony of so many victims. Jessica herself was given the opportunity to speak, and she stood slowly, her voice barely audible as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, I know that what I did was wrong," she said, her words carefully rehearsed but lacking genuine emotion. "I was desperate and scared, and I made terrible choices. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused, especially to my mother and my children." Even her apology felt calculated, focused more on minimizing her culpability than accepting responsibility for the harm she'd caused. There was no acknowledgement of the systematic nature of her crimes, no recognition that she'd built a criminal enterprise that had devastated dozens of families. Judge Williams deliberated for less than an hour before returning to announce the sentences. The courtroom was absolutely silent as he began to speak. "The defendant's crimes represent a particularly egregious form of fraud," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "They systematically targeted vulnerable elderly victims, exploiting trust and stealing not just money, but dignity and security. The impact on victims has been devastating, and the sentences must reflect the seriousness of these crimes." Jessica received 12 years in federal prison, with restitution ordered for all victims. Kevin received 10 years with similar restitution requirements. Neither would be eligible for early release, and both would face years of supervised probation upon completion of their sentences. As the court officers led them away, Jessica turned to look at me one final time. There was something in her expression that might have been regret, but it was too late for apologies or second chances. She had made her choices, and now she would live with the consequences. The months that followed were a period of healing and adjustment for all of us. Tyler and Emma gradually adapted to their new life with me, and we developed routines that helped them process their grief and begin planning for their futures. Tyler threw himself into his studies, determined to earn a college scholarship that would give him opportunities his parents had squandered. Emma found solace in art and music, expressing her emotions through creative outlets that helped her make sense of the trauma she'd experienced. I discovered that raising teenagers again at my age was both challenging and rewarding. Their presence filled my house with energy and purpose, and watching them grow into responsible young adults despite their parents' failures gave me hope for the future. The restitution process was lengthy and complex, but eventually most of the victims received at least partial compensation for their losses. My own financial situation was fully restored, and the credit monitoring systems put in place ensured that no one could abuse my identity again. 6 months after the sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from Jessica. She had been assigned to the prison's financial literacy program, teaching other inmates about budgeting and debt management. The irony wasn't lost on me, but her letter suggested that she was finally beginning to understand the impact of her actions. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she wrote, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone who deserves a second chance. I'm learning about the lives I destroyed and the trust I violated. I hope that someday, when I'm released, I can find a way to make amends for the harm I've caused." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Forgiveness would take time, and trust would take even longer to rebuild. But for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt hope that my daughter might eventually become the person I'd always believed her to be. Today, Tyler is a sophomore in college studying social work, inspired by his desire to help people who have been victimized by crime. Emma is a junior in high school, planning to study law so she can advocate for elderly victims of fraud. Both of them have grown into remarkable young adults who understand the importance of integrity and compassion. As for me, I've learned that standing up for yourself sometimes means making difficult choices that hurt the people you love. But I've also learned that real love requires accountability, and that protecting someone from the consequences of their actions isn't kindness, it's enabling destruction. The Christmas Eve dinner that started this journey taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. The woman who quietly accepted humiliation in her own kitchen became someone who fought for justice, not just for herself, but for every victim who needed a voice. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest, but that doesn't mean we have to accept their abuse. Sometimes family means having the courage to say no, to demand better, and to refuse to be anyone's victim. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.